Hey guys, just to let you know, this is part two of a video series on the 2022 election. For part one, go check out AussiesElect's channel, and then you can come back here to hear about how this election turned out the way that it did. So without further ado, let's introduce my guest today, AussiesElect. How are you going?
Hello, I'm very tired because we just recorded the first part and that took a while, but I'm happy to do this part two and talk about, I guess, how we got here and where we're going.
So yes, thank you. So let's start at the beginning for this election, which obviously was the end of the 2019 election. So it's the end of the 2019 election. The Labour Party is absolutely devastated after being ahead in the polls the whole way through. To face a defeat was just unbelievable, and it left the Labour Party and the left in general with a lot of soul searching. How are you feeling at the end of 2019?
I think I was feeling the exact same way as everyone else, absolutely devastated, and but I did sort of understand why I thought Labour lost. I kind of got it, and all of the sort of like a post-mortem that the Labour Party did with their own report. I think it was like Wayne Swan and Craig Emerson or something did
It's
like a
Jay Weatherall, I think, actually.
oh, that's right, Jay Reverall and Craig Emerson did like a report on why they thought Labour lost, and I pretty much agreed with everything that was said in that.
So
Sorry.
that's so like for me, it felt like all I could think of is it was either Bill Shorten was just really unpopular, Labour might have been just being a bit too ambitious with their policies and just scared moderate voters, and others have also potentially argued that Scott Morrison just was somewhat of appealing. He felt like he kind of was accidentally put up at the top rather than other prime ministers at the time who all sort of were seen as very ambitious and putting their own ambitions before Australia. Scott Morrison kind of felt like this new guy that kind of was reluctantly put at the top that he didn't want to be there, and that kind of sort of humanized him a bit, and I think gave him popularity.
Yeah,
However,
well,
you go on.
he still had that sort of like blokey, daggy dad quality. Everyone sort of took that on merit at the time. They believed that he was just an everyday bloke, whilst Bill Shorten just seemed like some cut out politician. So yeah, the leadership was one severe issue, as was the focus on too many policies, as was the too much of a focus on climate protesting. So there was a lot of factors that went into it, and Labor tried very, very hard to make the 2022 election not the same thing that was the 2019 election, and I think they have seemed to have succeeded.
So yeah, so obviously Scott Morrison's popularity didn't last very long because come the bushfires came probably the first stuff up of the coalition government, which was their very poor handling of the bushfire response. For initially, the bushfires weren't necessarily the government didn't necessarily do anything horrendous on the bushfires, but the optics of it was just so bad. When Morrison was basically photographed in Hawaii after refusing to tell people where he was, and then to come back and with lines like "I don't hold a hose," and then just trying to get those forced photo ops with him handshaking bushfire victims. I would always thought that his government was dead then. Like I generally thought people have seen the true ScoMo and they're never going to elect this guy again. What did you
Well,
think then?
yes, I mean, I thought that, but at the time, I remember thinking that like he's got this quality where he's able to appeal to boomers, and I thought that his popularity would slowly recover over time because he's just very good at marketing himself.
I'd argue that that was somewhat true
Yeah,
because he
I think
did
it
win a
was
swing towards him in Eden Monero where that infamous photo happened. So you
yeah,
are somewhat right there. So let's say so. Obviously Scott Morrison was able to recover a bit there, but obviously we forget a lot about what happened after the bushfires because only like a few months after the bushfires, COVID-19 arrived on our shores and basically ended up dominating the vast majority of this parliament's term, hasn't it?
yeah. Well, I mean, until a couple of months ago, it was absolutely the everything on everybody's lips. Yeah.
And you're mentioning Scott Morrison having quite a radical response to COVID. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so Scott Morrison did a lot of things that other sort of conservative leaders wouldn't do. So he closed the borders, which is something that Boris Johnson and Donald Trump like. They had to really be pushed to do that. He gave out stimulus to low unemployed people. He had this massive coronavirus supplement, which was this ongoing payment of doubling welfare for well over a year, I believe it was. Um, so he had a response which seemed sort of uncharacteristic of the kind of guy that Morrison was, who was sort of like a boring conservative who approached things with caution and didn't want to interfere too much with the free market. So I believe people saw Morrison as a quite a strong leader who's able to do the things that are necessary when he has to do them. Um, he,
I,
he he imposed restrictions. He did quite unpopular things.
I'm going to
Um,
actually disagree with you on a bit here. Like, maybe this might be hyper partisan me talking, but when it came to the COVID response, yeah, I would agree with the border shutdowns. But in some respects, JobKeeper came quite late. In fact, it was the Labour Party that initially proposed such a scheme before the Liberals took it up. And I
yeah.
believe job seeker payments were done in most states. That's wasn't super radical. But the part I was a bit surprised, I have to disagree with you on, was the lockdowns and restrictions. That was actually the states that implemented those policies. And initially, Scott Morrison opposed a lot of those responses until he found out a lot of them were politically popular, and then he changed his tune. Um,
Well, I think it was that the fact that he sort of allowed that stuff to happen and he allowed the states to sort of make their own
if
decisions.
anything, I actually felt like he didn't want it to happen, but his political wrangling in that time was very weak. I've actually, it's a characteristic I'm not sure, we're not sure we'll talk about a bit later, but I have generally found this parliament quite ineffective. There were several stories shown whenever the coalition tried to push policies like that IR bill a bit later on. They struggled to get the numbers in the Senate to vote it, and it was kind of contrasted with another controversial bill in Victoria that the Andrews government was able to pass because they were actually able to work with the independents to get their support. Whereas Scott Morrison, we were actually questioning whether or not the Commonwealth was breaking up. We were acting a lot more like the United States, where the states do their own policies. Um, Partly because Scott Morrison wasn't being the central figure in running the COVID response. It was kind of every state for itself.
Yeah, he was at the very beginning, and you did talk about JobKeeper, how it was he had to be pushed to do that, and that is true. He originally said that it was a dangerous idea, the idea of JobKeeper, but he did go through with it, and that was a lot of money that they spent on JobKeeper, and I think people sort of like respected his ability to maybe abandon his own ideology, which is quite um, economic conservatism, to do something that was necessary. But you're right, he did give responsibility to the states pretty early on, and this did two things for his favor. It meant that anything that the states did wrong, he wouldn't be given the blame for. But it also meant that if anything the states did right, that they would get a lot of the credit. He took some of the credit. He took a fair bit of the credit, probably way too much credit for what the states did. Well, I mean, at least. But in the case of states like Western Australia, it made the premier of the state stand out.
And I guess you are right, because I think it actually was a part that hurt him in the long run, because he came across as very disingenuous. He was right there in your face when it was coming to taking credit, and he was nowhere to be seen when it was coming to take responsibility for bad things. And I think, I'm not sure we haven't talked about this much, but I do think that actually is what probably started to get him that image of being sleazy and untrustworthy, which I think is what eventually brought him down. Because as you know, going into 2021, the coalition was polling at like 53%. Like, I don't think the coalition had had such a monumental lead in the polls and were just holding it. Not even during the Abbott era or the Turnbull era did the coalition ever successfully have a lengthened period of being above water in the polls. So, obviously, let's talk a bit more about 2021 and what led the polls to narrow up and then flip again. What do you think were the big issues that began to tank Morrison's popularity?
Right. So I think that everything started to go downhill when the whole um, Brittany Higgins and Christian Porter saga began. Um, that's when people started to sort of question Scott Morrison's ability to empathize with people.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. Like, I think empathy has always been a big issue for Scott Morrison. Like, the fact that he has an empathy advisor, despite him being quite a passionate Christian, is always something that's kind of confused me a bit. Um, but yes, like, obviously the infamous we should be glad our protesters aren't being met with bullets, which was a very poorly received line. And just the fact that it seemed almost as if the coalition was feigning ignorance on covering up a potential rape allegation in Parliament House was quite shocking. And I think the polls were almost narrowing up then, but that kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back, and it was when Labor
Yeah.
finally took the lead in the polls. But I think other things were at play. For instance, the large amount of government waste that occurred during JobKeeper, I think, also hurt the coalition. Do you have opinions on that? Like the 60 billion
Y-
that
Yeah,
went missing?
well, that's right. Well, that's what the issue was, that like whilst you could have said that they took their response to COVID was quite well, it absolutely was far from perfect. And the fact that they refused to force those companies to repay the JobKeeper that they earned despite making profits, um, that was what made the government look a little bit amateur. And it made them look like they're also far more interested in corporate welfare than they are at giving like disadvantaged people the money that they need.
And I guess because you're right, because that comes right off Robodebt, right? Because Robodebt was where
That's
the
right.
government went massively after welfare recipients who might have been paid a bit extra, and yet had no interest in chasing after Harvey Norman after he received a bunch
Yeah.
of unnecessary
So it
payments.
showed that there was a big interest for the government to punish disadvantaged people, but turn a blind eye to corporate welfare.
And obviously, as we saw during the pandemic, lots of state governments getting re-elected. Obviously, most notable being the NT government got re-elected, the ACT government got re-elected, and the big ones, obviously, Queensland defying after the 2019 wipeout for Labor in the federal election was able to hold on and actually gain seats in the state election, and but then that was obviously paled by obviously the Western Australian landslide in which Labor took a monumental majority and turned it into, I don't even know what you call that. Like they basically control the entire state now in every aspect. The Liberal opposition has been completely demolished there, and I know the Liberals were concerned that obviously they're being wiped out in a lot of states. But at the same time, they're like, well, they weren't trying to see it as a partisan thing. They were seeing more as an incumbency thing and hoping that incumbency advantage would play to them. Did you feel that way like going to the elections? Like thinking the polls were just wrong and the Liberals were going to win just simply off their incumbency in 2021?
Well, yeah, I think that because their COVID response was better than a lot of other countries, especially comparable countries like the US or the UK, they were seen as having as a bit of an advantage at that point in time. But things kind of kept on going wrong for them. There was a lot of scandals. There was sports rorts, and later on car park rorts. There was what was some of the other stuff?
Oh yeah, there's so many. It's a bit like the Trump effect, isn't it? There's just so many scandals; it's hard to remember all of them.
Yeah, I mean it's all kind of a blur to me now. But I think it really paints.
There was the flood rorts as well in 2022.
Yeah, there sort of eventually was painted a picture that Scott Morrison was not a very nice person, um, and a lot of his colleagues came out to agree with that, and also that they had a very weak agenda, judging by the fact that they refused to really implement an ICAC legislation into Parliament, by the fact that the only real policy they seemed to have was tax cuts, which the Labor already supported anyway.
There was the tax cuts, the media bargaining code, which was basically just Google paid Murdoch money, and then
Yeah,
obviously
and
probably the most infamous one.
that was also a shit show.
Yeah,
The media bargaining code with what happened with Facebook.
yeah,
Um,
and there's also the infamous one, probably being the religious discrimination
yeah,
bill.
yeah, which they scored a massive own goal on that one too. So uh, it's, I mean, it's I struggle to sort of see how people really could defend that the government when they really didn't seem to have any vision for the country at all.
Yet,
Uh,
despite that, Morrison was always pretty much has always remained preferred prime minister throughout the vast majority of this parliament. Despite his party being so much underwater, he was always seemed to be more preferred than Anthony Albanese. Do you think that's got something to say about Scott Morrison, or do you think that's got something to say about Anthony Albanese?
I think it's after the COVID pandemic happened, a lot of people saw Scott Morrison as this strong figure who they liked, and they kind of held on to that daggy dad image of him for until he was removed. Um, it was just that whilst there was a lot of people who had that image of him, there was a lot of people that really hated him too. Like a lot of people who completely detested him, because they could see through the fact that he was basically a charlatan. He was just a salesman. He wasn't genuine with really anything he did, and everything was all about politics and was not about what was better for Australia.
Well, that's what I want to. I think you've brought up a topic that I want to mention. I actually think Australia changed quite drastically over the last 3 years. I think we have grown a much stronger appreciation for government than I think we had in 2019. One of the cases I usually make here is nobody knew who their premier was. Very few people knew who the premier of their state was. People knew the prime minister because they're quite popular. But come COVID, not only did people know who their premier was, they knew who other states' premiers were. I don't think Daniel Andrews would be as high profile a premier had COVID-19 not happened. Same with Mark McGowan, Anastasia Palaszczuk. These are now all household names because the government was forced right into the forefront of the picture because of this pandemic. And I think, as someone who's kind of supports the ideas of what government can do, I've been kind of happy that people are starting to appreciate government for the first time. What feels like 40 years since the introduction of Reaganism kind of made government bad as sort of the main talking point for the public. I've been kind of glad to see that notion finally be broken down and people actually say, no, government can do good things.
A lot of right-wing conspiracy theories believe that COVID was created in order for governments to be seen as more benevolent than they were seen as before. So yeah, you're kind of onto something. But yeah, when it comes to COVID, I think that's probably where Scott Morrison was his greatest strength, but also his greatest weakness. Because whilst in 2020 he seemed to have done the right thing for the most part when on COVID, in 2021 he really stuffed up a lot of things. He stuffed up vaccines. He clearly was focusing too much on the AstraZeneca cheaper vaccine and didn't think to, when he was offered Pfizer vaccines, he didn't think to take it, which was a major stuff up because it led to Australia not getting vaccinated very fast, which led to lockdowns lasting longer than they should have. He also failed to build established national quarantine, which would have prevented all of those leaks out of those ineffective hotel quarantine systems. And then in 2022, and I think late 2021, he failed to order enough rapid antigen tests, which led to people not being able to know if they had COVID, which meant to it spreading, which meant to people having to take time off work, which meant to people not working, which led to supply issues, which led to shops shelves being completely empty of food. And that was the point where people were like, wow, this guy really, doesn't know what the hell he's doing.
And that's when we got the news poll that I think had Labor at like 41% of the first preferences and like 54 to 55% of the two-party preferred. I was kind
Yeah,
of at that.
exactly.
That was probably the height of the anti-liberal news polls because that was like right before the election campaign, which is obviously what we want to talk about next. So obviously, um, I guess we should mention briefly. Obviously, before the election, we had the South Australian election, which was somewhat of a wake-up call for the Liberal government there because the Liberal government in South Australia obviously lost the election. They became the first post-pandemic government to lose re-election, so it basically showed the Liberals that Labor could potentially win an election from opposition even during the COVID pandemic. And having that election happen just before the federal election, I think, definitely rattled a lot of nerves, especially after some evidence leaked that tying former Premier Stephen Marshall to Scott Morrison was one of the reasons he lost his re-election, was just because he was a Liberal. I'm not sure how true that was, but it was just one of the many things that was putting pressure on the federal Liberals. So obviously we get to the federal election itself, and the polls are basically showing quite clear for Labor to win, which is why I found some of the early stuff at the start of the election quite interesting. And I think one of the things I really want to talk to you about today is the media coverage in this election. Starting off with obviously the not knowing the unemployment figure gaffe. What was your opinion on how the media handled Albo's gaffe? Or like, do you think the gaffe was a big deal, or do you think the media was blowing it out of proportion?
Right. I think that the gaffe was definitely a problem for Albanese, but I think that the media focused on it way more than they ever should have. And again, with the whole NDIS gaffe. And what's interesting about those gaffes is, whilst the media was obsessed with them, they didn't seem to affect the opinion polls very much at all, especially news poll, which stayed 53, later went up to 54 throughout the whole campaign. So a
I
lot of
thought there was
people,
a bit of narrowing up after the first week of campaigning, but you're right. It didn't like continuously narrow up. It sort of narrowed up, then spread out, then narrowed up, and then spread out.
yeah, yeah.
I
Um,
was generally just a bit shocked at the media because I know the media was quite biased towards the coalition in 2019, but I was, maybe I was optimistic. I genuinely thought they were probably going to flip this election because I thought most of them had had enough of Scott Morrison. So it somewhat actually surprised me how hard they went on the coalition, like, highlighting massive Labour gaffes while ignoring coalition gaffes.
mm,
Was definitely
yeah.
something that surprised me a lot in this election. It.
Well, we all know that the media, for the most part, is very biased towards the coalition. And we saw that absolutely with this
I
election,
just felt
especially.
like it hit a whole new low here. Like it seemed like they just did not care that the coalition had arguably run one of the most corrupt and incompetent governments
Yeah, yeah.
in the modern era.
Yep, and also Scott Morrison avoided going on the ABC, apart from one interview with Lee Sales. He wouldn't do the National Press Club. He wouldn't do a
And
debate.
I'd also point out that one interview he did, in a lot of the cases, they just let him just lie in front of the camera with next to no challenging on the points he was making.
Yeah, yeah. And that's Scott Morris, something Scott Morrison is known to do very well, which is lie
And the question
about.
is it because he's doing it well, or is it because the media just lets him get away with it? And that's obviously one of the big questions people talk about.
So when it came to the Teal independence, uh, obviously there was a dissatisfaction with the coalition when it came to how they handled the ICAC, and how they seemed to handle climate change, always turning it into a political football, never really seeming to have a plan to act on it. I don't think technology, not taxes, was really helpful at all, because they were seen as not really interested in investing much in renewable technology. So they
Actually,
didn't really
I did want to speak a bit
offer.
about that.
Yep.
One of the big focus the coalition was doing was trying to fearmonger about Labor, but this is where Labor had obviously tried to go a reasonably small target campaign, only pushing the most uncontroversial policies out there, like a federal ICAC and better jobs and wages. Do you think that the coalition's attacks on taxes and other sort of woke issues, as they would say, do you think they were sort of coming on deaf ears because of Labor's more small target approach?
it almost felt like they were trying to run the exact same campaign as the 2019 election, but it wasn't really working. They tried to have like like a big tagline against them, like instead of it's the bill Australia can't afford, it's now it's not easy with Albanese. And they're always claiming that Labor is going to come after you with taxes, but despite the fact that the Labor Party had said no taxes other than multinationals. They tried the border thing, and nobody was sort of buying that. Yeah, it was this attempt to kind of just scare everyone with all the typical tactics. But I think Labor had expected that they were going to use this kind of uh, angle and were prepared for it.
And like obviously, Labor's big thing was like staying on camera. We support boat turnbacks. We aren't planning to raise any taxes. Just staying on camera. That I'm not sure. Sometimes people say once you start stating that, you're actually already losing the argument. Um, but it seemed like you're right. It didn't. I don't think it was working as effective. In fact, in some areas, people were concerned these Labor's response to these attacks were actually driving support into third parties. Now, that's obviously what we saw happen. But initially, when I was watching this campaign, I was like, look, as much as progressive people hate how right wing the Labor's got or how much the Labour Party's mean the coalition, I was still myself in a very 2019 mindset thinking, look, if Labour went progressive, they're just going to get destroyed like they were in 2019. Was that a sort of similar feeling you were getting that, like, of course Labour has to run to the centre, otherwise they're going to be wiped out like they were in 2019? Or were you actually yourself going, no, the Labour Party should actually be trying to push more ambitious climate policy and stuff?
No, I think what they did with the climate change was very, very smart, where they basically took a coalition policy and they kind of just like yanked it up a little bit. As for when it comes to other policies, I think it's possible they still could have won if they kept things like the capital gains tax discount, getting rid of that, and getting rid of like negative gearing. But I think it just would have inflamed the argument that Labor is all about tax. And so for them to be able to say, well, the only thing we're going to do is multinational tax, it just meant that they were able to completely just chop off the head of that argument, and just meant that that argument would not work at all against them, by having like literally nothing. So I think it was a very smart move. It does mean now the Labor are in power, that they don't have a lot of things that they can do. Like they can't raise taxes at all anymore because they'll make them into a liar. They can't do anything stronger on climate change because they'll make them into a liar. That's the only sort of issue that they have. But thankfully for them, the whole debt and deficit argument got destroyed by what happened with COVID, and how the government, the Liberal government, ended up just spending so much money, going into so much debt and going into so much deficit, that for them they wouldn't really have a reason to talk about deficit as much as they did, because they were already putting so much deficit in. So Labor was able to then say, hey, we don't have to worry about this anymore. We can have higher deficits than the coalition, and it wouldn't hurt us that much. And I guess that's the reason why they left till like the second last day to reveal their costings, so that talk about who would have the higher deficit wasn't on the stage for very long.
And that's what I want to bring you to my next point here, which is the fact that, to a lot of people's surprise, the polls were in some respects wrong. That Labour was obviously predicted to get around 35 to 40% of the two-party preferred, of the first preferences, and they instead only got about 32.8, which is surprisingly worse than they did in the 2019 election. Now, be it, we still have got a lot of pre-poll to come through, and by the end of that, Labour might have actually got back up to 33, possibly a bit higher, but they still vastly underperformed in first preferences. Even if they did somewhat get similar to the two-party preferred, I guess a part of me was surprised because I saw Labour got dumped. They dumped Bill Shorten, who was the unpopular leader. They ran to the centre, so they weren't controversial, and they were sort of positioning themselves as the safe change party, which is why I'm just shocked that they got such a low first preference count. What do you think? What do you think resulted in this 32.8%?
I think it was, um, it's like I think it was partially because of the large attacks from the coalition, just they're constantly going on the negative and worrying people about voting for Labour, and
I also
also
think it was partly the media basically trying to
yeah,
nitpick
and the
everything
media.
Labour was doing while ignoring
That's right.
other
And
things.
especially like when it comes to Albanese's gaffes, made people a bit unsure about him. So it made people want to say, okay, well, all right, fine. I don't like Scott Morrison. Albanese seems like a bit of a goose. I guess I'll vote for someone else. But I still prefer Albanese to Scott Morrison, or I still prefer the Labour Party to Scott Morrison. So therefore, I'm going to give my second, third, fourth preference to Labour over the coalition.
And I
Um,
think, oh, sorry, go on.
um, it does seem very strange that Labor did even worse on their primary vote than the 2019 election, which was a disaster for them. It was just the case that this was the kind of election where getting the first preference didn't really matter that much. It just mattered that you were better than the other major party.
And if anything, one thing I've been wondering about with this election is did the electorate change? I have a strong suspicion that, as I was saying earlier, I think COVID changed the electorate. Um, Suddenly, things like government spending and action on climate change became more of a big deal because there's a much greater focus on government. And I don't think either Labour or Liberals saw this. And this is part of this is why I'm kind of glad we had a party like the Greens who are unabashedly progressive because they were the one big winners of this. They and the Teal Independents who pushed that stronger progressive message, I think were able to win a lot of votes off people because of that unabashed view. And had Labour known about this, they might have tried to run a more shortened, like 2019 campaign than this run to the centre campaign that they ended up doing. Do you feel a bit that way? Do you think Labour might have actually had better luck if they had actually been a
No,
bit more ambitious?
I think it was a very smart move what they did running to the centre, because it meant that they were able to soak up a lot of disaffected Liberal voters into them and seem sort of like as a stable, sort of safe choice alternative to the coalition. I mean, it's kind of like what Kevin Rudd did in 2007, where he seemed was like basically like a John Howard light. Basically the Labour Party was this time was like, we're just like the coalition, except we actually care about fighting corruption. We actually care about climate change and are willing to do something about it. And we actually care about the housing situation, but we're not going to ask people to raid their super to solve the issue. So they going to the centre was a very good idea. Of course, this did mean that, as some people expected, they would lose some seats to the Greens, which they have. They've lost Griffith. They almost lost McNamara to the Greens. So there was that fear was realised, but I think it was a smarter move to capitalize on the center than it would have been if they decided to be more progressive.
Yeah, like I'm a little skeptical of that, just because I know a lot of the notion around this election was the fact that Labour wasn't really pushing any difference. It's like, why vote for Labour if they're no different? I don't know how effective that messaging was.
I don't agree with you. I don't agree with you. I think that Labour was able to say how they were different to the coalition. I think that and the fact that they were able to do that with a small target is
I'm mainly just going off what like the mainstream media sites were saying, because of course, again, they were trying to see doubt in people to get them to vote the coalition. For goodness sakes,
yeah.
The Age did that 4-page vote for Josh monstrosity.
Yeah, well, yeah, the media was pushing that like, oh, Labour and coalition, they're basically the same this time. But
You may as well just keep the coalition in then.
yeah, but no, I think the Labour Party were able, especially during Albanese's debates, he was able to say how he would be different to the coalition. The coalition didn't want a $1 an hour pay rise. Labour did. That was at least one big one.
It just feels like it wasn't big. Like, it feels like if they were landing, Labour would do better in this election. They would be at least 35, if not closing in on 40, and potentially winning 80 seats. And
yeah, well,
we wouldn't be here discussing
as you're saying though,
minority government.
You were saying though, they had to fight the massive amount of doubt that the media and the coalition themselves were seeding into people's minds about the Labour Party.
Well, let's get on to the actual. So obviously, it looks like Labour might have just eked out a majority. Like they might have potentially got anywhere from 77 to 79 seats, which would give them at least a majority. and I'm curious to see where things go from here. What do you think Labor's first priority will be now that they're in government?
Uh, well, I mean, they've been talking about it. They're going to try to aim for a minimum wage increase. They're going to aim to get a federal ICAC up. They're going to aim to implement their climate change policies. I think it's pretty obvious what they're going to do now that they have a majority government and they have a very workable Senate. They will do what they promised to do, and they won't be touching things like tax for a very long time. Possibly not until after the election. How about you? What do you think?
Well, there's that, and there's a few other things. Obviously, like they've apparently pledged to introduce the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which would probably require a referendum on uh, Aboriginal recognition in the Constitution, which would be fun because I've never voted in a referendum in my life because I was 4 when the last one happened. There is a lot they got to get done. They want to get done, and it's interesting how much they'll be able to get done. I'm also interested to know how much the electorate will accept it. Because one of the big things I'm interested in is because if you remember the coalition was pretty much hated the vast majority of the time. Like, we elected Abbott and then immediately hated him. We elected Turnbull, then immediately hated him, and then we elected Morrison and almost immediately hated him. Like, do you think the Labor government will actually be able to potentially govern popular for at least the 3 years? Like, actually give us a government that we actually don't spend the whole time hating, or do you think Australian cynicalism will just once again drive us away from yet another incumbent party?
My vibe is that the Labor Party will definitely have a honeymoon period. They'll absolutely succeed in the next couple of months. It all just comes down to how well they execute everything for how they do. I think Albanese is a little bit of a bimbo. Well, not a bimbo. He's not dumb. He's a little bit. He's.
He's
I don't
not.
know.
He's not commandeering. Like, he's not very commanding. Like, he doesn't like
No. He's a bit
grab the
clumsy.
situation and take it.
He's a bit clumsy, and that might lead to a few funny gaffes. A lot of people have called him, or on the right are calling him, like Australia's Joe Biden. I don't think he's that bad, but you might see some little kind of like goofy issues. It might be endearing, or it might be seen as that he's just so weak and silly that he's not a proper leader. I don't know yet. I guess we'll see.
And I guess the other issue is also going to be looking at the economic situation we're in now, because a lot of people have said the coalition was bragging about how good our economy was, and the reality is, a lot of people said it's not because we have a better economy; it's just we haven't experienced the worst that the other countries have. We're actually likely to experience much worse economic figures in these next few months as we experience what the other places have had, and I think it's actually going to be very uneasy for the Labour Party, because despite the fact that they're going to have no responsibility for this, they're probably going to get hit very hard with economic attack messages, just simply because they'll be taking over, arguably just as the pandemic, arguably as this new recession is hitting its peak. Do you think do you think the economic woes will last for this year, or do you think we might see economic woes going on for longer?
Well,
Like,
I've got people talking about how there's going to be a food crisis soon. Like, I don't know. Like, it is not a great time, honestly, to be in power. To earn government.
To be honest, this is Labour's speciality. They always come into power at like the wrong time. So Rudd came into power right before the GFC. Whitlam came into power right at the energy crisis. Curtin came into power at World War II. Scullin came into power before the Great Depression. Like, unfortunately, Labour has a very bad habit of getting into power right at the wrong time.
Yeah, well, I mean, it could have been getting into power before COVID, but thankfully Labour managed to miss that one. Yeah, I think that it's going to be difficult for the government to deal with a lot of these crises, and they are probably going to be blamed for it, just as the coalition were. I do have faith in Albanese that will manage to deal with the situations, though. But perhaps that faith is
that's the thing I pointed out to people. Like, the issue I have with Joe Biden is not the fact that there's mass inflation in the US. It's like, what is Biden doing to help the people in this crisis? I don't necessarily blame Biden for the crisis, but I blame him for not addressing the crisis properly. And I that's the big difference I want to see Albanese make from Joe Biden, is for Albo to actually do the socially progressive things or the economically progressive things, and help keep people supported and financed. Like obviously, just arguably take a page from what Kevin Rudd did during the GFC and make sure everyone's in solid condition. And I think we should hopefully be able to weather this economic storm that we are currently in. Speaking about that, did you want to have a really far off look at what the next election will be like?
Oh, look, because I'm feeling optimistic at the moment, I feel like Labor's going to increase their majority next election.
Well, let's
Uh,
have a look first. Let's start. When do you think the next election's happening? Do you think because it feels like we have gone so long without having an election occur early. The last time we had an early election was in 1998 under Howard, and since then every election has gone pretty much the full 3 year term. Do you think
okay,
we're in need for an election, say 2024 or even 2023? Like, do you think?
no, no, no. So Labour Party will almost certainly have a majority in the lower house, it seems, um, and they will have a pretty good Senate, a very workable Senate for them. So they'll have no reason to go to an early election. It's a government's only really go to an early election unless there's something they really want to do, or that the Senate is not very good for them.
I'm just
Um,
interested because of what the situation might be in the Liberal Party, which we'll talk about if you're ready.
okay, sure,
Because
okay.
we're
Well,
discussing, it's highly likely that Peter Dutton is going to become the new leader of the Liberal Party.
mhm,
I
yeah.
can see that being arguably a big boon for the Labour Party. I struggle to see how Peter Dutton as opposition leader could possibly win an election. I think, especially maybe after the horror that was Tony Abbott's prime ministership, I don't think the electorate would be fine electing another hardcore conservative like Dutton. And in some respects, Labour might have the benefit that even if the economy's in disaster, um, the fact that Dutton's leading the Liberal Party allows him just to win by default. Because the case I point to there is Gavin Newsom in California. It's a pretty unpopular governor, but he won his last re-election because the Republicans elected an absolute nut job to challenge him. I don't know if you see that as the future, is the fact that even
Right.
if even if the things are going bad, the Liberal Party might just be completely unpalatable.
So the Liberal Party basically have two options now. They have the option to go with Peter Dutton and basically go with the right, one would assume, or go with someone else, such as Karen Andrews or Dan Tehan, and try something maybe more moderate. Um, those are their two options. Some people would say that the coalition should do things like, say, abandon net zero and take an even more economically conservative stance.
I guess the
Um,
argument there would be every time they've gone more conservative, Abbott, Morrison, they've actually benefited, and when they've run more to the left, that's when they've actually done worse. I'm not sure if.
yeah, well, that's what a lot of people like. I was reading the Sunday Telegraph earlier today, and that's kind of what they were saying. They were kind of saying like, well, Tony Abbott had massive victory, and it was only when they sort of abandoned their policies that they went, down the shitter. And then
There's arguments that people much rather consistency in their parties rather
mm,
than necessarily the parties trying to meet this sort of middle Australian.
yeah, I mean that could be right. It could just be that people just want, if they're voting for something, they want that or something. Yeah. Commentators are saying that if the coalition become more socially conservative, they'll be able to win outer suburban and regional votes, uh, or seats, which are more sort of usually Labor territory. I don't know how much that is going to work, um, but
I guess you could
it's
argue
even.
that One Nation could be a tester for that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. One Nation, have been around for a while, and we know what they're like, and they haven't sort of succeeded with doing that kind of thing. Yeah, well, yeah, it's a question about, do they go even further on the Catherine Deves route? Do they abandon the inner city seats and they just go full frontal, searching for social conservative votes? That's one option, and the other option is go a lot more moderate, try to win back those inner city seats, basically try to do a Malcolm Turnbull, but actually do what Malcolm Turnbull said he would do, because a lot of people didn't like Malcolm Turnbull in 2016 because they believed that he wasn't actually doing, what he wanted to do, like what he presented himself, the kind
And
of person that.
I think I guess you kind of hit the nail on the head here about the whole thing in the electorate. Is there are talks at the moment that maybe Australia just isn't a country that could be run by two parties anymore. We might have an electorate that's just too diverse these days, that one party simply cannot appease 50% of the population. There is a potential that if the Liberals put a moderate, they might win those inner city seats, but they're going to lose the outer suburban seats. And if they run hardcore conservative, they'll win the outer suburban seats but lose the inner city seats, and they just can't please both groups anymore. There is a general possibility that this might be the end of the two party system. We just can't Parties just can't win a majority of votes anymore. And the preferential system allows that because of how votes are allocated.
So if we look at the last, is it 4 elections? There's been so many elections. 2010, 2013, 2016, 2019, 2020. Okay, so the last 5 elections. 4 of them were either a minority government or very, very close to being a minority government. So that is showing that it's only like 1 or 2 seats off, basically. So that is showing that it's becoming harder and harder for a major party to get a majority of seats. The crossbench is growing, and we've seen that with this election. So this election sort of opened the floodgates, because now that all of these independent third-party people are seen as a viable option, minor parties are going to start saying, we can actually do this. We can actually beat them. We can take seats that are usually safe and make them our own. And so there's going to be a lot of people trying to copycat this kind of thing next election. Maybe they'll need a billionaire to help them, like Simon Accord. But there's definitely a possibility now for being able to cash in these disenfranchised voters.
There's also the other thing I also want to mention here is I often think like Labor made some really dumb mistakes in their last government under Rudd and Gillard, which the main thing obviously being knifing Rudd and putting Gillard in, and then doing the same to Gillard and putting Rudd back in. I'm actually really curious to know that, like, obviously Labor's been bashed all hell because as opposition they can't do anything except campaign against a pretty hostile environment in the media and the coalition. Now that they have government, there is a possibility, this is probably me wishful thinking as a Labour supporter, that they could use their power in government, get some really big wins, and actually drive their support back up, and hopefully, come the next election, actually see themselves get that 40% again and actually have a comfortable win now that they're in government, and hopefully have learnt their lessons from the Rudd Gillard saga and don't make those same mistakes they did.
If they're able to show that they are a competent government where everything doesn't just fall apart whilst they're in power, that will boost their primary vote by at least a couple of percent. That's
and
all
also
they
likely have the percentage that hopefully even after this economic strife is hopefully not going to last 3 years, and we should potentially be going into the next election with a economy on the rise, which people might potentially look past the disasters of this year and possibly next year and see a rising economy and then have the benefit to vote Labour off that. Again, we don't know where this is going. We are very much talking about events. Like, who could have seen COVID coming in 2019?
I think at the moment, the Liberal Party are so decimated and destroyed that it's just difficult to think that they can recover so easily in 3 years. Like, the Labour Party obviously felt pretty devastated after 2019, but I didn't
at least had 68 seats, though.
Yeah, I didn't feel like it was a complete destruction. I just feel like it was a bit of a wet noodle, like a bit of a fail.
And even if Labour is in not a very strong position, they are in a very strong position on the state level. They basically control everything in Western Australia. They had a very comfortable win in South Australia. They are comfortably in control in Queensland, comfortably in control in Victoria, have been in control for forever in ACT. Not so strong in the Northern Territory, but and they're also potentially about to win New South Wales. Like, the Labor Party seems to be strong on the grassroots level, and that usually helps drive you on the federal level. Meanwhile, the coalition is obviously in a much weaker position in the state level. That is also possibly going to hurt them in the future. Especially, we probably won't see it now, but I know in WA there is very few prospects for Liberal staffers to find careers up to being MPs. And that might also be the case in some of these other states, where the Liberals might soon find their base of recruits dwindling.
Yeah,
Again,
well, this is a massive, absolute punch in the gut for the Liberal Party. They'll need to change.
is this their
They'll
worst
need to
defeat
talk-
ever in modern history?
I mean, it's the lowest primary vote they've ever gotten, as far as I know. As for worst defeat, I'm not sure about that.
I'm going to check the 1987 election of Australia, which is their worst defeat. How much did they get in that election? They got 62. Yeah, this is currently looking to be worse than the 1987 defeat, which was their worst.
What was their primary vote in the 1987?
In 1987, actually, it was not that bad. They just didn't win many seats. 1987, they got 45.9%. But remember, there was less third parties back in the 80s.
They got literally like 10% less this time. Yeah.
They actually came close to winning the two-party preferred. Now it's a bit of a weird list. So let's go look at the 2007, which I think is their worst. 2007, they won 36. They've won 42 again. They've pretty much always won 40% of the vote. Like,
yeah.
Again, because they don't have the Greens siphoning away large chunks of their voters. This is So it sounds to me like Labor's actually pretty well poised for the next few years, even if they don't have the best government. It's likely that they just don't really have an opposition at the moment in some respects.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't like. I mean, the media is going to obviously be on the Liberal Party side, whatever they do. So that will help them. And they have the money, of course, behind them from all the donors. So
I'm not sure how much donors want to donate to a party that's like this. It's going to be interesting to see.
Well, I don't know. I feel like there's something they can do, but at the moment they're just so destroyed that it's just hard to see how they're going to put everything back together.
Well, I think it's getting pretty late now. I think it's obviously later for you in the east. So I think we'll probably wrap this up here. I'm going to probably look forward to looking at this video in 3 years' time on the eve of the next election to see how many of the predictions we got right. And
all right, yeah. Okay, well, let's before now that we're on the sort of subject, how many seats do you think Labor's going to get in the next election, the 2025 election?
All right, I'm predicting Labor does really well. Again, I'm being very optimistic here, and I see them potentially winning mid-80s in a very comfortable win because of strong economic growth following this pandemic, and just people being glad that we finally have stable government after years of Rudd, Gillard, Morrison. Like, we have yet to feel like we've had a genuine stable term of government. Like, Morrison did not deliver that as much as he believed he did. So I'm kind of hoping that Abbott would deliver that, and it was reward him with basically a mid-80 seat win in the next election. And the Liberals are going to have so much trouble winning all those independent seats back. What about you?
Yep, I'm gonna say the same thing. I think the Labor Party will win mid-80s seats.
So I'm going to guess 85 seats next election, but we'll see where we are then, because it's going to be the climate's going to be so different then.
Yeah, it will be. We don't know what to expect. Maybe we'll have COVID 2.0. We don't know.
That's called the Delta strain. For us.
Yep. All right. This has been AussiesElect for this big two-part epic post-election post-mortem. Thank you everybody for watching, and Solomon will see you later in one of his videos, and I'll see you later in one of my videos.
All right, guys. You heard it. With that, we are heading off. Adios.